Hey, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Today, making a Japanese style chef's knife. So, a longtime shooting buddy of mine, Jeremy Sims, recently commissioned me to make a chef's knife. Now, we ended up agreeing on a Japanese style chef's knife, and so in today's video, I'll show you how I made it. So, I'm going to be forging the blade from 1095 high carbon steel. As I go, I'll talk a little bit about how Japanese kitchen cutlery works and what the distinctive features are that distinguish them from Western style cutlery. Now, bear in mind, the goal here is not to exactly duplicate a Japanese knife, but to just sort of use that style to borrow some of the basic principles and then incorporate them into something that I might more naturally do. For the sake of information, I'll discuss some of the ways that this knife departs from traditional Japanese knives as we go. We'll start at the forge, roughly shaping the blade with the hammer. The first thing I'll do is to put a point on the bar. I like to do as much forging as possible without using tongs, so in a case like this where I've got plenty of stock to hold on to, I'll work on the blade first, then turn to the tang later. Tongs, even good ones, are never as secure as holding the stock directly. Now I'm just kind of finessing the point, using very soft blows. One of the things about forging is that you just want to let the hammer do the work. You don't have to brutalize the steel or rush things. Take your time and you'll get there. A quick mark on the anvil to roughly gauge the length that I'm aiming for. Now I'm forging a bevel into the blade. Unlike a normal Western knife, I'll just forge a single bevel onto one side of the blade. This is one of the most obvious differences between Japanese kitchen cutlery and Western knives, which of course normally have a bevel or slope ground into each side. Now I'll continue forging the bevel further up the blade. Now some gentle editing to clean up the lines. Now, after chopping off the excess stock, I'll use a guillotine hardy tool to neck down the blade into the tang. This guillotine tool allows for the forging of a nice, clean, symmetrical step down into the tang, which is pretty tricky to do with a hammer alone. Traditional Japanese knives, like most forged blades, even in the West, are typically hidden tang types, meaning that the entire tang is encased inside the handle. So, the tang will be forged into a thin taper that will slide up inside that handle. Now I'll normalize the blade, heating it several times to about 1600 degrees and letting it cool. This causes the grain structure of the knife to grow smaller, improving the toughness of the blade as well as making it easier to get really sharp. The finer the grain of the steel, the better the ultimate sharpness that can be achieved by that blade. Then it's on to the grinder. I'll start by grinding the backside of the blade. As I said earlier, the backside of the blade will be ground dead flat. Then it's on to the bevel side. The client wanted a rustic look to the blade, so I'll only grind the bevel partway up the blade, leaving some of the scale and hammer marks for visual interest and character. Now, using a file guide, I'll file the junction between the handle and tang. This little fixture helps you make this perfectly flat and symmetrical so the blade mates to the handle without unsightly gaps. If you're interested, I've done a video on how this little guide is made. The next step is to harden the blade. With that, I'll mix up some refractory cement and then apply it to the blade. Taking another cue from the Japanese sword world, I'll heat treat it using a clay hardening method similar to the technique employed in sword making. This actually is not typical of Japanese cutlery. Carbon steel is hardened by heating to about 1500 degrees and then rapidly cooling the steel, which causes the crystalline structure of the blade to reconfigure into a very hard structure known as martensite. The clay acts as both an insulator and a heat sink so that the steel that's covered in clay doesn't cool quickly enough to harden. Once the clay dries, I'll heat the blade in the forge. You might have noticed that when I was normalizing the blade earlier, I was tapping the blade with this magnet on a stick. Steel goes non-magnetic at about 1425 degrees Fahrenheit, so that gives me a starting point in gauging the temperature of the steel. When it reaches the necessary temperature, I'll plunge it into an industrial fast quench heat treating oil. Now, we could use water as a quenchant, but that substantially increases the likelihood of the blade cracking. So for this knife, no thanks. Within seconds, the steel has hardened. After cleaning it off, I'll temper the steel at 400 degrees in a heat treating oven, causing it to soften enough to reduce the brittleness of the steel, which reduces the likelihood of cracking or chipping further down the line. A little more cleanup on the grinder and an actual cutting tool is starting to take shape. Another difference between most Japanese knives and their Western cousins is that the bevel is ground all the way to the edge rather than leaving a thicker portion to be sharpened into a micro bevel. This makes Japanese cutting tools ungodly sharp, though it also makes them significantly more brittle and likely to chip than Western knives. So just a little tip, if you do buy Japanese style kitchen knives, you definitely want to be very careful about how you store them so that you don't ding up the edges. You can also make out the hamon or temper line. this faint wiggly white line which appears at the junction between the hardened and unhardened portions of the steel, just like in a traditionally made Japanese sword. Now I'll turn to a Japanese water stone, which I'll use to flatten the back of the knife. In order to make the edge function correctly, the back side of the knife has to be extremely flat, flatter than can easily be accomplished on a belt grinder. This is a slow, tedious process that adds quite a bit of time to construction. But if that back is not flat, the edge will wander, which will not only be cosmetically bad, but will make it very difficult to sharpen correctly in the future. It's worth mentioning that many Japanese edge tools, including knives, will actually have a slight hollow ground into the middle of this backside surface to facilitate the flattening process, and that will leave just this thin rim of steel that has to be ground away when sharpening. Grinding this hollow properly takes a very large radius stone or grinding wheel, which I don't have, so I'm not doing that here. These humongous stones are really characteristic of Japanese knife making, and you just don't see them anywhere outside of Japan. American knife makers just don't have them. Anyway, when we're done, you can see that the front side has a completely different appearance from the back because of the differing grinding and polishing methods. Now we'll turn to the handle. Japanese kitchen knife handles are intended to be replaceable, so most commonly they're made from light, soft wood of the same type used for Japanese sword scabbards, a wood known as ho or honoki. In this case, however, we're going for a more permanent decorative handle, so we'll be using an old piece of zebra wood or zebrano that's been sitting around my shop for quite some time waiting for the right knife. There are plenty of ways of doing this, but in this case, I'll split the piece in half on my bandsaw and then flatten the two halves so that they mate nice and cleanly. Next, I'll use some chisels that I made specifically for Japanese sword scabbard construction. Frankly, this wood is not much fun to work with a chisel. It's very hard, has a somewhat unpredictable grain, and it's very splintery. Everything that makes chiseling hard, but we'll make do. The main thing is just to be patient and keep testing the fit until it's right. Once we've got a nice slip fit, we'll assemble the whole thing and glue it together. Then it's back to the grinder to shape the handle. Once we've got that all squared away, I'll epoxy the handle onto the blade. Japanese knives are traditionally friction fit, meaning that they're basically pounded onto the tang until the handle wedges tightly onto the metal. But again, that is not appropriate for a really hard, splintery wood like this. A soft wood like hinoki will conform to the tang, but a hard, exotic wood like this will tend to resist conforming until it eventually just splits. A little polishing for the wood. I also made a little scabbard so that the blade won't get dinged up in the drawer. Again, that was made from zebra wood. I won't show the making of that, however. And that's it, ready for the kitchen. I'll tell you, one of the things that's amazing about these Japanese style knives is just how sharp they end up being. As I said, it makes them a little more vulnerable to chipping, but wow. Hope you enjoy the knife, Jeremy. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon. Thanks for watching, guys. If you like what we're doing here, please subscribe and make sure that you click on that bell so you get notified of all the latest videos. Want to buy a knife from me? Check out my modern blades at tacticsarmory.com. Digging the channel? You can support our video making efforts on Patreon. You know, I've been banging away on these videos for like 10 years, so I hope you'll show some love for all that hard work. Link in the cards and descriptions. Finally, if you're interested in making Japanese swords, check out my full line of Japanese sword videos where I show how to forge Japanese swords as well as how to polish them and how to make fittings, handles, and scabbards. WalterSorrellsBlades.com.